The weight of the tray was a familiar ache in my shoulders, a dull throb that had become the background music of my life. For 3 years, since dropping out of the architecture program I couldn't afford, my world had been a repeating cycle of starched uniforms, polished glasses, and the low hum of conversations I was paid to ignore. Tonight, the hum was richer, the glasses were crystal, and the air smelled of money and old roses. Julian Croft's annual garden party was the peak of the season, a job everyone in the catering company wanted and dreaded in equal measure. We were ghosts in his perfect world, meant to be efficient, silent, and invisible. I had seen him before, of course. Julian Croft was a quiet pillar of the city, a man whose name was etched onto the sides of museum wings and university libraries. He was older, maybe 50, with hair the color of salt and pepper, and a stillness that seemed to pull the energy from a room and gentle it. I'd watched him from behind floral arrangements and stacks of plates at a dozen different functions. I'd cataloged the way his eyes, a deep, quiet gray, would crinkle at the corners when he was listening intently, and the way he held a wine glass with a casual grace that made it look like an extension of his hand. He was an object of distant, impossible fascination, a figure from a life so removed from my own it might as well have been a painting. My own life was a study in careful budgeting and managed expectations. My apartment was small, the walls thin, the view a brick wall belonging to the building next door. I sketched designs for buildings I'd never propose on napkins during my breaks, the ghost of a dream I'd been forced to set aside. Loneliness was a constant companion, a quiet roommate who didn't help with rent. Seeing Julian Croft was like looking up at a distant, steady star, beautiful, untouchable, and a painful reminder of how far I had to go. I had a single photograph, torn from a society magazine my last roommate had left behind, tucked into a book on my nightstand. It was a picture of him dedicating a new public park, his expression serious but kind. A foolish, secret thing to keep. Tonight was different. Tonight, we were not in a rented ballroom or a sterile gallery. We were in his home. The house itself was a masterpiece of stone and glass, nestled into a hillside overlooking the city. It didn't shout its wealth, it breathed it. In the grain of the dark wood floors, the perfect lighting that made the art on the walls seem alive, and the seamless way the manicured gardens flowed into the wild hills beyond. It was a space designed by someone who understood light and shadow, strength and grace. It was a building I would have given anything to design. The inciting incident, when it came, was mundane, almost comical in its clumsiness. I was navigating a tight knot of guests near the grand piano, my tray laden with flutes of champagne. A woman in a shimmering silver dress turned abruptly, her laughter sharp and loud, and her elbow connected with the edge of my tray. The world tilted. For a heart-stopping second, I tried to correct it, my muscles straining, but physics was not on my side. The tray tipped, and a cascade of pale gold liquid and delicate glass crashed onto the polished floor. Silence fell in a perfect circle around me. The music seemed to stutter. Every face turned, a sea of judgment and annoyance. My own face burned with a heat that felt like it could peel my skin off. My boss, Maria, would kill me. My paycheck would be docked. The shame was a physical thing, a hot stone in my stomach. I knelt immediately, my hands fumbling as I began to pick up the larger shards of glass, my mind a frantic buzz of apologies that wouldn't form on my tongue. Leave it, the voice was low, calm, and cut through the noise in my head like a foghorn. It wasn't angry. It was simply a command, delivered with an authority that expected to be obeyed. I looked up. Julian Croft was standing over me. Seen this close, he was more imposing than I'd imagined, but not in a threatening way. He was solid, grounded. The lines around his eyes were deeper than they appeared in photographs, testament to years of thought or worry. His gaze wasn't on the mess. It was on my hands, which had started to tremble. He saw me. Not the uniform, not the mistake, but me. He gestured to one of the other staff members. Get a dustpan and a towel for this. And bring another round of drinks for these guests. He handled it with an efficiency that was both breathtaking and deeply calming. The knot of onlookers, their moment of drama over, began to murmur and turn away. Then, he looked back down at me, still kneeling foolishly amidst the wreckage. He extended a hand. Come on. Up you get. His hand was large, warm, and dry. His grip was firm, not crushing, but steadying. He pulled me to my feet as if I weighed nothing. For a moment, we stood there, his hand still loosely holding mine. I could feel the faint, reassuring texture of a callus on his palm, the sign of a man who did something other than sign checks. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, something subtle like cedar and bergamot. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice still quiet, meant only for me. I finally found my voice, though it came out as a croak. "Yes. I'm so sorry, Mr. Croft. I'll pay for the glasses." A flicker of something, amusement, surprise, crossed his face. He let go of my hand, and I felt the loss of its warmth immediately. "Don't be ridiculous. They're just glasses." It was an accident. His eyes scanned my uniform, where a few drops of champagne had splattered. "Let's get you cleaned up." He didn't wait for an answer. He simply turned and started walking toward a hallway I hadn't noticed, tucked away behind a large abstract sculpture. He expected me to follow, and I did, like a ship caught in a gentle but inexorable current. We moved away from the party, the music and chatter fading behind us, replaced by the soft sound of our shoes on the stone floor. It felt surreal, like stepping through a hidden door into another reality. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and a strange, unfamiliar flutter of something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. He led me into what appeared to be his private study. It was a world away from the gleaming, public spaces of the party. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, crammed with books that looked read and cherished, not just displayed. A large, worn leather armchair sat near a fireplace where a low fire crackled, and a massive desk of dark, polished wood was covered in neat stacks of papers and architectural models. It was a room of substance, a place of quiet work and thought. It felt more like him than the entire party outside. He went to a small wet bar in the corner, took a clean cloth, and dampened it under a tap. He turned and handed it to me. "Here." Our fingers brushed as I took it, a spark of contact that felt entirely different from the handshake. This was smaller, more intimate. I mumbled my thanks and dabbed clumsily at the spots on my jacket. He watched me, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smiling, but the stern set of his jaw had softened. He leaned against the bar, crossing his arms over his chest, an posture that should have been intimidating, but instead felt like he was simply settling in, giving me space. "What's your name?" he asked. "Leo," I said, my voice steadier now. I looked at my name tag, as if to confirm it. "Leo Vance." "Leo," he repeated, testing the sound of it. The way he said it, my simple, common name sounded significant. "Well, Leo, that was quite a spectacular crash. You have a flair for the dramatic." I felt a blush creep up my neck again, but his tone was gentle, laced with a dry humor that put me at ease. "Not usually. I prefer to be invisible at these things, a worthy goal," he said, his eyes scanning the room as if remembering all the parties it had seen. "But not always achievable." He pushed off the bar and walked over to his desk. He picked up one of the small, intricate models, a beautiful design of sweeping curves and clean lines. "Do you have any interest in architecture, Leo?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it knocked the air out of my lungs. It was like he had reached into my chest and pulled out my most guarded secret. I stared at him, my mouth slightly agape. How could he possibly know? Was it just a random guess, prompted by the models on his desk? I used to. I finally managed to say. "I studied it." For a while, he nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful as he looked from the model to me. "It's a demanding field. Requires a certain kind of patience, a certain kind of vision." He set the model down carefully. "Maria, your boss, is a formidable woman. I'll have a word with her. Make sure she understands this wasn't your fault. You don't have to do that," I said quickly, the thought of him intervening on my behalf both mortifying and deeply touching. It was a gesture of protection, a quiet act of care that I had no right to expect. "I know I don't," he replied, and his eyes met mine across the room. There was a weight to his gaze, a sense of quiet assessment that made me feel entirely seen. "But I'm going to. Now, you should probably get back before they send out a search party." He gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Try to stay away from the champagne." I nodded, unable to form another word. I turned and walked out of the study, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. As I stepped back into the hallway, the noise of the party washed over me again, but it sounded different now. muted and distant. The world had shifted on its axis. The invisible wall between his life and mine had been breached, not by me, but by him. He had reached across the divide, pulled me over for a moment, and then sent me back, fundamentally changed. Back in the fray, Maria caught my eye. She gave me a look that was a mixture of terror and curiosity, but before she could speak, she gestured for me to take over the bar in the library. It was a quieter post, away from the main traffic. A demotion, perhaps, but I felt a profound sense of relief. The library was an annex off the main hall, quieter and cooler. Guests drifted in and out, taking their drinks to leather armchairs to hold hushed conversations. From my station behind the long mahogany bar, I had a clear view through the arched doorway into the main party. It gave me the perfect vantage point to observe. My earlier, abstract fascination with Julian Croft had now become sharp and specific. I was no longer just watching a man. I was watching the man who had held my hand, who had spoken my name, who had looked at me and seen something more than a clumsy waiter. I watched him move through the crowd. He was the perfect host, attentive and gracious, but I could see what I hadn't noticed before, a subtle distance he maintained. He would listen, nod, and smile, but there was a part of him held in reserve. His smiles were polite, practiced. They rarely reached the deep gray of his eyes. I saw him engage with a senator, his posture formal and correct. I saw him listen to a famous actress, his expression one of patient amusement. But only when he was alone. For a brief moment looking out at the gardens his house was built to celebrate, did the mask seem to slip. I saw a flicker of something weary, something lonely, in his expression before it was smoothed away as another guest approached him. My mind replayed our conversation in his study, his question about architecture. It couldn't have been a coincidence. Had he seen something in the way I looked at his house? Had my yearning been that transparent? I began to analyze every word, every gesture. The way he'd said my name, the warmth of his hand, the quiet promise to speak to Maria. These were small things, but in the barren landscape of my emotional life, they were monumental. I felt a dangerous seed of hope taking root in my chest, and I tried to crush it before it could grow. Men like him didn't concern themselves with men like me. This was a brief act of kindness, a rich man's noblesse oblige. Nothing more. To think otherwise was to set myself up for a fall I couldn't afford. And yet, I couldn't stop watching. I couldn't stop the internal monologue that tried to decipher the man behind the public facade. The power difference between us was a vast, uncrossable canyon. He owned this house, this land, this view. I owned a worn-out pair of black shoes and a student loan debt that felt like a life sentence. He could end my career with a word or elevate it, as he had so casually offered to do by speaking to my boss. That power was terrifying, but the way he had used it, gently, protectively, was intoxicating. Later in the evening, as the crowd began to thin, he came into the library. He didn't come to the bar. Instead, he went to a bookshelf, his back to me, and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound book. He stood there for a long moment, just holding it, his fingers tracing the gilded title on the spine. I busied myself, polishing a glass that was already spotless, my eyes fixed on his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. I could see the tension in his shoulders, a slight rigidity that hadn't been there when he was performing his duties as host. He finally turned and walked toward the bar. My heart gave a painful lurch. He set the book down on the polished wood, and I saw that it was a collection of blueprints from a famous modernist architect, one of my personal heroes. "A slow night back here," he said, his voice a low murmur that was a welcome respite from the high-pitched chatter of the remaining guests. "It's better this way," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. Less chance of a dramatic flare, the corner of his mouth twitched in that ghost of a smile. "Probably for the best," he gestured to the book. "I saw you looking at the house earlier. When you first arrived, you weren't looking at the guests or the decorations. You were looking at the joinery in the ceiling beams," he had noticed. He had noticed me before the accident, before I had become a problem to be solved. He had been watching me, just as I had been watching him. The realization sent a jolt through my system, a dizzying mix of validation and vulnerability. "It's an incredible building," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "The way the light hits the west wall in the afternoon. It's perfectly designed. I designed it," he said simply. My jaw must have dropped, because he added, "A long time ago. It was my first and last project. I found I had more of a talent for business than for art, There was a note of old regret in his voice that resonated with my own fresh grief for a lost future. As he spoke, he reached out and straightened a stack of cocktail napkins on the bar, his fingers brushing against mine for a fraction of a second. It was nothing, a meaningless, accidental touch, but it felt like an electric current. My breath hitched. I pulled my hand back as if burned. He didn't react, his expression unchanging, but I saw his gaze drop to my hand and then back to my face. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. In that moment, the careful boundary between staff and host, between rich and poor, between his world and mine, felt impossibly thin. I could feel the soft gravity of his presence, pulling me in. It was terrifying, and it was everything I wanted. The party was finally winding down. The last of the guests were being guided to their cars by valets, their laughter echoing in the cool night air. The catering staff moved with the practiced efficiency of a retreating army, breaking down tables, packing away dishes, erasing all traces of the night's festivities. I was tasked with helping clear the outdoor terrace, a sprawling stone patio that overlooked the glittering city lights. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. One of the large, portable heating lamps we'd set up began to sputter, its flame flickering weakly before dying with a soft hiss. One of my co-workers, a kid named Ben, fiddled with the propane tank, grunting with frustration. "It's busted. The valve is stuck." Maria, my boss, came over, her face tight with exhaustion. "Just leave it. We'll deal with it in the morning. Let's just get everything else packed up." She was stressed, eager to get her crew and her expensive equipment off the property. "Let me see." The voice came from the doorway to the house. Julian Croft stood there, having shed the jacket to his tuxedo. He was in his shirt sleeves, the crisp white fabric stark against the darkness behind him. He looked less like the host of a gala and more like a man ready to get to work. He walked over, his stride purposeful. "Mr. Croft, please, you don't need to worry about this," Maria said, her voice flustered. "My staff will handle it." He waved her apology away with a gentle hand. "It's no trouble. It's my house. I don't want a faulty gas lamp left on my terrace overnight." He crouched down, his movements fluid and easy, and examined the valve. He was completely unconcerned with the fact that he was a billionaire in a bespoke shirt, kneeling on the stone pavers to fix a piece of rented equipment. He was simply a man solving a problem. He looked up, not at Maria or Ben, but at me. "There's a small toolbox in the study, on the bottom shelf to the left of the fireplace. Could you bring me a wrench?" The request was simple, direct. He wasn't ordering me. He was asking for my help. We were, for this brief moment, collaborators. I nodded and went back inside, my feet moving quickly. I found the toolbox exactly where he said it would be. It was old and heavy, the tools inside worn and well-oiled. These were not the tools of a hobbyist. They were the tools of a man who knew how to use them. When I returned, he took the wrench from me, our fingers brushing again. This time, I didn't pull away. I held his gaze. He gave me a small, conspiratorial nod, and then turned his attention back to the heater. I knelt beside him, holding the flashlight on my phone to give him better light. Our shoulders were inches apart. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a steady, solid heat that had nothing to do with the failing lamp. We worked in a small bubble of shared purpose, the sounds of the catering pack-up fading into the background. "So," he said, his voice low as he worked the wrench, "you said you studied architecture for a while. What happened?" The question was personal, but his tone was casual, as if we were just two men fixing a machine. The setting, the shared task, made it feel safe to answer honestly. "Money," I said, the single word holding the weight of a much longer, more painful story. My scholarship fell through, and my family, well, they couldn't help. I had to drop out. I hadn't said those words aloud to anyone in years. Admitting it felt like reopening a wound. He stopped turning the wrench and looked at me. The beam from my phone illuminated the sharp planes of his face, casting his eyes in shadow. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was absolute. He wasn't offering pity, he was offering empathy. It takes courage to step away from something you love to do what you have to do. With a final, firm twist, the valve loosened. He turned it, and with a soft whoosh, the flame in the lamp reignited, casting a warm, golden glow over us. He stood up, wiping his hands on a handkerchief he pulled from his pocket. "There," he said, looking at the steady flame. He then turned his gaze to me. "I worry, sometimes," he began, his voice dropping even lower, more thoughtful, "that when you have resources, people assume your interest is an attempt to control. Or to buy something." He paused, and his eyes were incredibly clear, searching mine. "My asking about your studies was just that. A question. I hope you know that. I'm not offering you a job or a handout. I was just interested in the man who noticed the joinery." It was a moment of profound vulnerability. He was the one with all the power, yet he was the one laying his intentions bare, giving me the chance to misunderstand, to take offense. He was explaining his own boundaries to ensure my comfort. He was worried about how he was perceived, not by his wealthy guests, but by me, the caterwaiter. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply considerate, that it cracked open the final wall of my own defenses. "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Thank you." He held my gaze for a long moment, and in the warm glow of the lamp he had just fixed, the vast canyon between our worlds seemed to vanish entirely. It was just us, two men, standing on a terrace under the stars. And for the first time all night, his smile reached his eyes. As the catering crew loaded the last of the crates into the van, a palpable sense of exhaustion and relief filled the air. We were all running on fumes, ready for the long drive back to the city and our own beds. I was helping to coil some heavy electrical cables when one of the last remaining guests, a man in a garish blazer who'd been loud and demanding all night, stumbled out of the house. He was clearly drunk, his words slurred. He swayed on his feet and pointed a finger at me. "Hey you, butler, get my coat. It's the cashmere one. Don't dawdle." The word butler hung in the air, dripping with condescension. I felt a familiar flash of hot shame and anger, an emotion I had learned to swallow down with practiced ease. My job was to serve, not to have feelings. I opened my mouth to give a polite, neutral response, to direct him to the valet who had his coat ticket. "His name is Leo." Julian's voice was ice. It wasn't loud, but it had a chilling quietude that cut through the drunkard's fog. He had appeared from the house and was now standing a few feet away, his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold displeasure. The protective stance was unmistakable. He had placed himself between me and the other man. The guest blinked, confused. "What?" "His name is Leo," Julian repeated, enunciating each word with precision. "And he is not your butler. The valet has your coat. I suggest you find him before you are no longer welcome on my property." The man's bravado evaporated under the steel of Julian's gaze. He mumbled something incoherent and shuffled away toward the front drive, thoroughly cowed. The confrontation was over in seconds, but the impact lingered. Julian hadn't made a scene. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply, and with absolute finality, defended me. He had drawn a line in the sand. I was not just a nameless part of the scenery to him. I was Leo. He turned his attention to me, the coldness in his expression melting away, replaced by a quiet concern. "Are you all right?" I could only nod, my throat tight. To be seen, to be named, to be defended, it was a powerful cocktail of emotions. It was more than anyone had done for me in a very long time. It made the silence I had been hiding in feel thin and fragile. The unspoken things between us were now impossible to ignore. His protective gesture had been a declaration. After the last van was loaded and Maria was doing a final head count, Julian approached me again. The driveway was empty now, save for his own dark, elegant car. The house behind him was quiet. "Walk with me for a moment," he said. It wasn't a question. He led me away from the lingering catering staff, down a small stone path that wound through a section of the garden. The air was fragrant with damp soil and lavender. We stopped by a small stone bench overlooking the sleeping city. The lights twinkled below us like a fallen constellation. "I apologize for that man's behavior," he said, breaking the silence. "It's not your fault," I said. "It comes with the uniform." "It shouldn't," he countered, his voice firm. He turned to face me, and in the faint light from the distant city, I could see the seriousness in his eyes. "I may have overstepped back there. It's a habit of mine, wanting to fix things, to protect things." He paused, and the air between us felt charged, electric. "I need to know if I overstepped with you." Here it was. The loaded question. The door he was holding open, waiting to see if I would walk through it. He was asking for consent, not just for his actions, but for the direction this entire night had been heading. He was ceding the power to me. I could shut it down, retreat into the safety of my role as a caterer, and this would all be over. Or I could step forward. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest. This is where I am. I am standing in a billionaire's garden, and he is asking me if I want him to want me. The thought is dizzying. No, I said, my voice clear and steady, surprising even myself. You didn't overstep. A slow breath escaped his lips, a sound of profound relief. Good. He took a step closer, and the space between us shrank to almost nothing. I could feel the heat of his body, see the flecks of silver in his dark hair. His gaze was intense, searching. Because I find, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, that I have a very strong desire to protect you. Leo, the subtext was gone. It was just text now, plain and undeniable. He valued me. The words hung in the cool night air, a truth that settled deep in my bones. It was my turn to be brave. I think, I started, my voice trembling slightly despite my resolve. I've been watching you for a long time. At parties, fundraisers, the confession spilled out of me, a torrent of stored-up observation and yearning. I thought you were from another world. Untouchable. I never thought you'd even see me, let alone talk to me. Or fix a heater with me. A small, shaky laugh escaped me. I feel like I'm in way over my head. He listened, his expression softening with every word I spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away. He just absorbed my clumsy, heartfelt confession with a quiet grace that made me feel safe. When I finished, a heavy silence fell between us, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything that had just been said. I saw you too, he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite name. At the museum benefit last spring. You were watching the keynote speaker, but you weren't looking at him. You were sketching the acoustics panels on the ceiling onto a napkin. I saw you at the mayor's dinner. You spent half the night in the corner, just watching people. You have a stillness about you, Leo. A quiet intensity. And a sadness in your eyes. I wanted to understand. He had been watching me. The reciprocity of it, the impossible, beautiful symmetry of our mutual observation, was staggering. The loneliness that had been my constant companion for years began to recede, pushed back by the light of his admission. The imbalance between us is significant, he continued, his voice low and serious. He was naming the elephant in the garden. My world is very different from yours. I will not pretend it isn't. But I want you to know, unequivocally, that my interest in you has nothing to do with what I have, and everything to do with who you are. He lifted a hand, slowly, deliberately, giving me every chance to pull away. He cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking gently along my cheekbone. His touch was warm, reverent. So I'm asking you, Leo, is this something you want to explore? With me? There was no coercion, no pressure. Just an honest question from a man who had shown me nothing but kindness and respect. The fear I'd been holding on to, the fear of being a curiosity, a plaything, dissolved in the face of his sincerity. Yes, I breathed. The word was a release, an acceptance, a beginning. He searched my eyes for another long moment, as if confirming the truth of it. Then, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of discovery. It was gentle, unhurried, and it felt like coming home. His lips were soft, warm, and the taste of him was faint, like the expensive wine he'd been drinking and something else that was uniquely his. I melted into it, my hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palms. He deepened the kiss slightly, a silent question that I answered by leaning into him, by letting my own stored-up yearning finally have a voice. It was right. It was unforced. It was the most honest conversation I'd ever had. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine. His eyes were closed, and his breath was warm against my skin. His hands moved from my jaw to my shoulders, holding me there, grounding me. Leo, he murmured, his voice husky. I couldn't speak. I just laced my fingers with his, a simple, profound gesture of connection. The world outside this small circle of warmth and quiet intimacy ceased to exist. It was just the two of us, standing in a garden, at the start of something I had never dared to imagine. The sound of a van door slamming shut in the distance broke the spell. Reality, with its logistics and its uniforms, came rushing back in. I reluctantly pulled back, the loss of his touch an immediate ache. Maria would be looking for me. I had to go. I should. I started, gesturing vaguely toward the driveway. A flicker of regret crossed Julian's face, but he nodded in understanding. Of course, the transition was jarring. A moment ago, we were two men confessing a mutual attraction. Now, I had to become an employee again, and he, the owner of the house. The power dynamic we had so carefully dismantled rushed back in to fill the space between us. A familiar unease began to creep into my stomach. Was this real? Or was it just a fairy tale for one night, a product of champagne and moonlight? Once I was back in that van, in my rumpled uniform, would I just become the clumsy waiter again? Julian seemed to sense my hesitation, the sudden return of my insecurity. He didn't step away. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out, not a business card, but his phone. He unlocked it and handed it to me. "Put your number in," he said. His voice was calm, steady, cutting through my rising panic. "I'd like to take you for coffee. Or dinner. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere we're not a host and a caterer. Somewhere we are just Julian and Leo." The offer was a lifeline. It was a deliberate, practical act designed to reassure me, to prove that his intentions extended beyond the magical bubble of his garden. He was already thinking about how to navigate the imbalance, how to make this equal. I took the phone, my fingers fumbling slightly as I typed in my name and number. I handed it back to him, our hands brushing one last time. He looked down at the screen, a small, genuine smile touching his lips as he saved the contact. "Thank you." He walked with me back to the driveway, where the last of the crew was climbing into the van. He stopped a respectful distance away, giving me space. But just before I turned to go, he stepped forward and his hand found mine, his fingers lacing with mine for a brief, tight squeeze. It was a silent, public confirmation. A promise. I climbed into the van, taking a seat by the window. As the engine rumbled to life, and we pulled away, I looked back. Julian was still standing there, watching us go, a solitary figure illuminated by the lights of the house he'd built. He didn't wave. He just watched, his presence a steady anchor in the receding darkness. The ride back to the city was a blur. My coworkers were a noisy mix of exhaustion and relief, recounting the night's mishaps and triumphs. I was silent, lost in my own world. The doubt was still there, a quiet, insidious whisper in the back of my mind. This was crazy. Men like him didn't fall for men like me. It was a fluke, a moment of kindness that had been magnified by my own loneliness and yearning. The harsh light of day would come, and the fantasy would evaporate. That was the internal test. The fear of waking up from a dream I didn't even know I was allowed to have. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my heart pounding. It was a text from an unknown number. "Get home safely, Leo. Jay." It was real. The thought was so overwhelming, so terrifyingly wonderful, that I had to close my eyes. It was real, and it was just beginning. The next few days were a strange mix of hopeful anxiety and mundane reality. I worked 2 more catering jobs, one a dull corporate luncheon and the other a chaotic wedding reception. At both, I felt like I was moving through a dream, my body on autopilot as I served drinks and cleared plates, while my mind was miles away, replaying every moment of the night in Julian Croft's garden. I checked my phone 100 times a day, rereading his simple text message as if it were a complex poem I needed to decipher. He said he would call, and I believed him, but a part of me, the part that had been conditioned by years of disappointment, braced for silence. He called on Tuesday. I was in the cramped break room, eating a sandwich and sketching on a napkin, when my phone rang with his unknown number. I answered it so quickly I nearly dropped it. "Leo." His voice, that low, calm resonance, was just as I remembered. It sent a shiver of warmth through me. "Hi." I managed, my own voice sounding ridiculously breathless. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "No, not at all. I'm just on my break." "Good." There was a pause, and I could hear the faint sound of papers rustling in the background. I meant what I said. "I'd like to see you again. Are you free for coffee tomorrow afternoon? There's a quiet place downtown, not far from the library." He was making it easy. "A public place. A simple meeting. No pressure." "Yes," I said, perhaps too eagerly. "That sounds great." We set a time, and he gave me the address. The call was brief, efficient, but underneath the simple logistics, I could feel the steady current of his intention. This wasn't a whim. This was a deliberate choice. The next day, I spent an hour agonizing over what to wear. Everything I owned felt cheap and inadequate. I finally settled on my best pair of dark jeans and a simple gray sweater, hoping I looked casual but not sloppy. I was 20 minutes early for our meeting, my nerves a tangled mess in my stomach. The coffee shop was just as he'd described, quiet, filled with the scent of roasted coffee and old books, with small, private tables tucked into corners. He arrived exactly on time. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a pair of well-fitting trousers and a dark blue cashmere sweater that made his salt and pepper hair seem brighter. He looked relaxed, approachable, but he still carried that air of quiet authority. His eyes found me immediately, and the warm smile that lit his face was just for me. It calmed my frantic nerves instantly. "Leo," he said, sliding into the chair opposite me. "I'm glad you came, I'm glad you called," I replied honestly. We ordered coffee, and for a few minutes, we made small talk about the neighborhood, the weather, the quality of the coffee. It was a little awkward, this navigation from our dramatic first meeting to this quiet, normal one. We were two strangers, in a way, learning the basic rhythms of each other's speech. Then, Julian leaned forward slightly, his hands wrapped around his warm mug, and his expression grew more serious. "I want to be transparent with you, Leo," he began. "I know our situations are very different. I'm older than you. My life is complicated and very public in ways I don't always like. I want to know you, but I will not do it at your expense. I need you to promise me that if you ever feel pressured or uncomfortable or like I am crossing a line, you will tell me immediately." He was starting with boundaries. He was starting with my safety and my agency. He was actively working to dismantle the power imbalance between us by giving me explicit permission to say no. The gesture was so profoundly respectful, it almost brought tears to my eyes. "I promise," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But you need to know, I'm not looking for a patron, Julian. I'm not looking for someone to solve my problems. I'm fine on my own. I struggled for the right words. "I'm just interested in you," he nodded, a look of deep understanding on his face. "I know. That's why I'm sitting here." And then, we talked. We really talked. For 2 hours, the coffee shop faded away. I told him about my parents, about growing up in a small town, about the fierce, burning passion I'd had for architecture, and the quiet shame of having to give it up. He listened with an attentiveness that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. He didn't offer solutions or pity. He just listened. In turn, he told me about his own life, about designing and building his house as a young man, a passion project before his father's business empire had claimed him. He spoke of his late wife, who had died of cancer a decade earlier, with a gentle sadness and a deep, abiding affection. He talked about the loneliness of his big, quiet house and the endless demands of his public life. He wasn't the untouchable billionaire from the magazines. He was a man who had loved and lost, who had his own regrets and his own quiet yearnings. When we finally left the coffee shop, the afternoon sun was slanting low in the sky. As we stood on the sidewalk, the city rushing around us, a comfortable silence settled between us. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "I'd like that too," I replied, a real, unforced smile spreading across my face. He didn't try to kiss me or even touch my hand. He just held my gaze. "I'll call you," he said, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that he would. A week later, I was back at his house. This time, I came through the front door. He opened it for me himself, dressed not in a tuxedo or a sweater, but in a simple, soft t-shirt and jeans. He looked like any other man at home on a Saturday afternoon. He smiled, and the house behind him no longer seemed imposing or grand. It seemed like a home. "Welcome," he said, his voice warm with a pleasure that was unmistakable. He gave me a tour, not of the public spaces I had already seen, but of his private world. We walked through the study again, and he showed me the blueprints for the house, pulling them from a long cardboard tube. He pointed out the details, explaining his choices, his voice filled with the old, dormant passion of the young architect he used to be. I was captivated, asking questions, tracing the lines on the paper with my finger. We were two architects, talking about our craft. We were equals. Later, we ended up in the kitchen. It was a beautiful, functional space, with stainless steel appliances and warm wood counters, but it had a lived-in quality. A coffee mug was sitting by the sink, a newspaper was folded on the island. It was a real kitchen, not a showpiece. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "I was going to make some pasta. I can help," I offered. And so we cooked together. He handed me a knife and a cutting board and put me in charge of chopping onions and garlic while he put a large pot of water on to boil. We moved around each other in the easy, companionable silence of people who are comfortable in each other's presence. The setting sun streamed through the large kitchen window, bathing the room in a warm, golden light. I was dicing an onion, my eyes starting to water, when he came up behind me. He didn't say anything. He just rested his hands on my shoulders, his thumbs gently massaging the tense muscles there. I froze for a second, then consciously made myself relax into his touch. I leaned my head back against his chest, closing my stinging eyes. He was so solid, so warm. His chin came to rest on top of my head. We stood like that for a long moment. The only sounds the bubbling of the water on the stove and the steady rhythm of our breathing. It was an intimacy that went beyond words, beyond kisses. It was a quiet, domestic moment of pure contentment. It felt like arrival. I turned my head and looked up at him. His gray eyes were soft, his expression tender. This was real. This man, this house, this feeling of peace, it was all real. The fear and insecurity that had been my constant companions were gone, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that felt like a foundation settling deep within me. He leaned down and gave me a soft, lingering kiss, the scent of garlic and onions and the warm, clean scent of him filling my senses. "I'm very glad you're here, Leo," he murmured against my lips. I looked around the warm kitchen, at this man whose heart was proving to be as beautifully constructed as his house, and I knew my life had irrevocably changed. I was no longer the invisible waiter, looking in from the outside. I was here. I was seen. I was home. The vast difference in our ages and our bank accounts was still a fact, but it was no longer a barrier. It was just part of the context of our story, not the story itself. The story was about a quiet man who noticed the joinery, and another quiet man who noticed the sadness in his eyes. And this was just the beginning. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.